Japanese gardens. A number of these are pictures that I've taken on this trip. I really am fascinated by Japanese gardens. Japanese gardens follow a very unique Japanese aesthetic and philosophy. Particularly, they are oriented around no artificial ornamentation. There is an absolute intentionality. Everything is done on purpose and with a point, but the intention is for it to look as though it happens naturally. The goal in a Japanese garden is to use plants and then worn materials, particularly worn stones, aged materials, in order to suggest an ancient and faraway natural landscape, to indicate the passage of time and also sometimes the fragility of existence. You will we'll talk about the use of stones and islands and things like that as we go along. These are all pictures that, again, that I took. Next time you're in Fukuoka, seriously, if you ever have a chance to go to Fukuoka again, there is a park in the city called Ohari Park. And the south end of that park, there is an extraordinarily beautiful Japanese garden. And one of the most special things about it is when Carolyn and I were there were only 2 other people in the whole garden. And so Japanese garden, and this is one, and I'll point out something to you. They have, I could have extended the picture over here, but they have a stone beach, which indicates like an ocean shore. And one of the characteristics that you will find in Japanese gardens is that they use miniaturization. They represent, a pond can represent the ocean, a stone or pebble beach can represent the seashore, stones can represent islands, although you often do have actual islands in the parks. But the whole point behind this is that it is supposed to be sort of a timeless capturing of a natural environment that gives one a sense of tranquility. Some of it too is this sense of awe, of just, it's as though your heart rate and your blood pressure go down 10 points when you walk into a beautiful Japanese garden. And part of the beliefs of Shinto is that whenever you have that sense of awe, then you are in the presence of kami. You are in the presence of spirits and the deities. And many of the symbols that you will find in Japanese gardens do represent kami of various kinds in terms of the Shinto influence. Again, these are all images that I've taken of gardens as we went along. But this is a garden as well. It might look like just a wild landscape, but this garden was begun in 1339. It's known as the Mas Garden in Kyoto, and everything in it is done on purpose. Gardens were first brought over from China to Japan in the Asuka period, between the early 500s and the early 700s. They first came to the island of Honshu, and on Honshu they began to add particular characteristics from the Honshu landscape because it's very mountainous. They did a lot with rugged, volcanic kinds of images using stone. Narrow valleys were represented, mountain streams with waterfalls, lakes, stone beaches, all of those kinds of things that they found in Japan were added to the Chinese idea of gardens. A little bit later in this lecture, I'll talk about the difference between Chinese gardens and Japanese gardens. The earliest of the Japanese gardens were intended entirely as pleasure gardens for the emperor and nobility. And they are strongly influenced by both Taoism from China and then also Shinto. In Taoism, there's the legend of the 5 islands which are inhabited by 8 immortals. The islands are right on the backs of turtles, and the immortals flew from their islands on the backs of cranes. And so you will see, both in sculpture and also represented by stones, images of turtles and of cranes. In fact, one of the parks we went to, the islands were specifically intended to be either turtles or cranes, and the cranes actually had stones to represent sort of wings. So in addition, you get a Shinto influence because of the idea that the kami are present in extraordinarily beautiful things, in waterfalls, in stones, in things of that sort. And everything, as I said, in Japanese gardens is intentional. This is not a Japanese garden. This is a Western European garden because in a Japanese garden you would not do anything that would look as artificial as this. Now, Western European gardens, French gardens, etc., can be very beautiful. But you think of the gardens of Versailles and the very carefully trimmed hedge mazes and that kind of thing. But this is much more what you will get in a Japanese garden. It is supposed to represent the, nature. This is created. This is a waterfall. Water is always represented in Japanese gardens. It's either represented by actual water, ponds connected by channels or cascades, or if it's a Zen garden or if it's a dry garden of other kinds, then they will use stone or sand. When you see the raked white stone in a Zen garden, for instance, frequently that represents the ocean, and they will sometimes rake it to represent waves. But the idea is that the visual appeal is because of an attempt to exemplify nature rather than to do something that is sort of artificially carved out. Again, I'm not speaking ill of European gardens. They have their own beauty, but that's not the aesthetic. There are three major types of Japanese gardens. There are the Tsukiyama, which are the hill gardens. The dry gardens are called Karensansui, and tea gardens are called Chaniwa. Each of those have a different kind of design, a different aesthetic, a different intention. When you get the hill gardens of Tsukiyama, then you will get this kind of cascading effect. Two main principles behind all Japanese gardens are, as I said earlier, scaled reduction. They will have a pond which represents the sea and a pebble area that looks like, along the edge of the pond that will look like a beach. They will scale down. Trees often will be scaled down to a smaller size. And the other part of it is symbolization. Everything in a Japanese garden, for the most part, is put there with the intention that it represents something else. There are stones that represent animals. There are cascades, all kinds of different symbols that are represented. If you have multiples of stones, then they're usually 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, typically odd numbers, 3 being the most common. If there are 3 stones, the flattest one will represent the earth, the tallest one will represent the sky or the spirit, and the middle one represents humanity, because it's between heaven and earth is the place of humans. And so all of these things, sometimes stones will be put to represent leaping carp, because carp have very strong symbolism in Japanese culture. The idea of carp, we'll see some pictures here in a minute of nishiki koi, the brocaded carp, but carp are very powerful swimmers. They will swim upstream, and it's thought when they swim all the way upstream, they turn into dragons. And so there's a strong connection there between carp and dragons. In Hiroshima, the baseball team are called the Carp. And we think, carp, what's that all about? Why didn't you name them the bluegill or something? Well, carp are a symbol of strength and a very important symbol in their culture. And again, there's always some sort of indication of water in every Japanese garden. If it doesn't actually have water, this is an example of a Zen garden or a dry garden. You have the stones of various heights, and then you will have the white gravel or sometimes sand. White gravel became commonly used as a sign of purity as well as water. It was used in Zen gardens, so Buddhist gardens. Also became commonly used around features in Shinto gardens, which would mean shrine gardens. And then even on the imperial properties, they would be used as a sign of purity and of the water flow around buildings and things of that sort. Water and stone are considered the yin and yang of the earth. And so water and stone, or stone and something that represents water, like this, will be paired to one another because they're seen as a balance. The yin and yang, the idea that all things are in balance. Again, that's something that comes over from the Taoist principles in China. But you'll notice that it's hard to see and projected, but this stone is raked to represent waves. Frequently sand or gravel, white stone in Zen gardens, it will either be raked in patterns, very carefully raked, because that's an act of meditation, of actually creating the very clean patterns. There will be circles around stones and then straight lines, so it's a meditation act, but frequently it's also used to represent things like water. There is a principle also called satueishi. I can't read my own writing. Satueishi, which means nameless or discarded stones. The idea that stones are sometimes seemingly put in random and they don't have any kind of intention behind them. But there's a principle called koa ni shitagan, or obeying the request of an object, which means a master gardener. And gardening in Japan is considered a very high art form, equal to painting or to calligraphy. And the master gardener will take each item that is very carefully selected and sort of request of the object, the stone or whatever else it is, or a plant, where it should be placed. And even though sometimes it looks like it's very random to us, there's a great deal of intentionality. This was the area, there's gardens over here, but these stones, you go, well, you know, they just planted grass around those. No, those stones were very specifically placed there. And the aesthetic is that the gardener determined that these were the right locations for these various stones. And so you do get this idea of placing an object where it needs to be, desires to be, is most appropriate. Even though it may seem random to us, there is virtually nothing that is random in a Japanese garden. I don't know if you've ever seen Japanese gardeners, but we've seen them down on their hands and knees with clippers trimming grass. You know, they are that meticulous about it. Do you have a question?
Question, yes. So this placement, is that based on trying to get to the symbol, or is it based on some balance with the trees and the landscape around that lawn?
Well, it's not a formal kind of balance. The master gardener would see this and say, this is the right place for that stone, and they would take into account all the other visual aspects of the area. But there's also almost a metaphysical sense in which each object has a right place to be. Remember, the stones and waterfalls and other natural features in Shinto beliefs have spirits frequently. And so in effect, what they are doing is asking the kami, the spirits that represent larger items particularly, where is their place? You know, where is it they wish to be? And then they make the placement based upon that. It is not, and I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute, it's not a formal perspective in the same way that we think about perspective. And I'll show you some, we'll talk about that when we talk about paintings as well. Bridges are also very important in Japanese gardens. They're usually made of natural materials, stone, wood, earth-covered logs. They can be either arched or flat, and frequently they'll be both. There'll be an arched bridge to a center island or stone, and then a flat bridge from that, or the other way around. Some of that has symbolism in being sort of past, present, and future as you cross over the bridge. In the case of Pure Land Buddhism, Pure Land Garden, or Amida Garden, the stone in the middle represents the Amida Buddha, who is the one, if you chant the name of Amida Buddha in faith, the Amida will, at the point of your death, deliver you to a paradise. And so the idea is from where you are, you reach the Amida, and then the Amida takes you on to the next location. So there's very much theology in that. Islands can, in addition to being the Amida Buddha, they may represent Mount Horai, which is the home of the 8 immortals of the Taoists. I think I have another bridge picture here. Yes. You sometimes will get flat bridges, you sometimes will get dramatically arched bridges, or combinations of those. This is a garden in Hiroshima, yeah. So another beautiful garden. I think some of you visited it because it was on one of the tours that we were able to take.
And that was the bridge that survived, right?
Yes, this is this bridge, stone bridge, survived the atomic blast. So it's been there a very, very long time. Here again, this is a Pure Land garden, and you'll notice there's an arched bridge to a center stone, and then a flat stone beyond that. So the idea of the Amida Buddha being the center point that will take you on to your ultimate destination. In addition to stone bridges, you often will find these stone lanterns. They're called daidoro. The daidoro originally were a feature of Buddhist temples, but then they became very popular. They used to light the way, the pathways through a Buddhist temple garden or around the temples. Later on, they were picked up by Shinto, and you'll now see them in Shinto shrines as well. Remember, when you say temple, it's Buddhism. When you say shrine, it's Shinto. So, but they're used in both places now, and they have very particular kinds of meanings. There are 5 sections here. The section that touches the ground, the legs, are considered the chi, or the earth. It represents the earth. The next level up, this level, it represents water, or the sui. The third level, the part that would have the flame in it, it represents fire, or the ka. The next level up represents air, or fu, this. And then the very top level represents spirit, or ku. This is part of the Buddhist cosmology, these 5 levels from earth to spirit. When you see pagodas, I'll mention pagodas a little bit this afternoon when we talk about art and architecture, but architecturally, the pagodas are actually a Japanese version, or modeled on the stupas from India. Stupa was a place where they would put relics, the bones or remains of a Buddha or a great teacher. They were sort of bell-shaped. When they came to Japan, they began to build them in levels, with different roof levels. And frequently there are 5 levels. Well, the 5 levels of a pagoda represents the same 5 levels, earth, water, fire, air, and spirit. And so you get this symbolism repeated in a lot of different kinds of things. You also will often find particularly at Shinto shrines, almost always at a Shinto shrine, just outside the torii. The torii is the gate with the double cross top. That is a symbol of the separation between the secular on the outside of the shrine and the sacred area inside the shrine. And outside the torii, before you enter into the sacred area, usually, I've seen a couple that are inside the torii, they will have what's called a sukubai. A sukubai is a stone basin. Sometimes if it's not a large shrine, it's not large, but some of them are, 5 or 6 feet long. And they will have water, flowing water, and there will be the bamboo, usually bamboo, although I've seen blue plastic ones too. There will be scoops, and you are to, before you enter the sacred area as a ritual cleansing from the stone tsukubai, you will rinse your left hand and then your right hand and then rinse out your mouth. And that's just a way of purifying yourself before you enter into the sacred area. So those stone basins are also very, very common. This is so much of what we see in a garden, as I say, looks random to us, and yet everything is very intentionally chosen. It's chosen based upon aesthetic principles to either hide something that would have been visible that's unpleasant, or that the gardener does not want you to see, or as a backdrop for something else. Frequently, it will be an intentional overlaying of colors. In this case, you've got the multicolored maple trees, and then you've got the very striking vertical lines of green bamboo. And so this is very intentional. All of the colors, the shape, the way things are trimmed, and they'll be trimmed in ways, usually, there are certain exceptions to this, but usually they'll be trimmed in ways that look natural. There's a certain school in Japanese gardening where they will trim things in a way that has clearly been artificially done, but that's not very common. In terms of the trees that the plants that you have, if it is a pond, if you have a pond that is still water, they sometimes will have lotus plants, because the lotus is one of the most sacred of plants, particularly in Buddhism, but in other religions as well, because the lotus grows with its roots in mud, in real mucky underwater. But then when the stalk grows up to the surface, the bloom will be purely white. And so the representation of being from the muck and awfulness that you can't see to a purely white flower is a symbol of holiness and sacredness coming out of the mundane of the secular. The most common trees that you will find in Japanese gardens are, and you've seen these, azaleas, camellias, oak, Japanese apricot, the cherry trees, and they have several hundred different kinds of cherry trees. The ones that are so famous, that have the brilliant blossoms, in the cherry blossom season, don't actually bear fruit, but they have a lot of kinds that do bear fruit. And so there's many different kinds of cherry trees. Maple trees, like these, willow trees, ginkgo trees, Japanese cypress, Japanese cedar, pine trees, and bamboo. All of them are very specifically chosen for their texture, for their color, for the contrast that they will give. And so all of these, if you ever see bamboo growing, it's not growing there. It wasn't a volunteer. It's not growing there wild. It's because the gardener chose to put it there. It's also very common in Japanese gardens to have koi. I did some videos of koi and unfortunately did not get very good photographs. I should have gotten better still pictures that I could put in here. These are nishiki koi, which mean brocaded carp because of the color. Carp like this can come in yellow, orange, white, red and white, black and white, black, white, and red, brilliant colors, and even blue. The various colorations are identified as different varieties of carp, and they all have their own names. The Japanese are very serious about this. They are special breedings from common carp. If they were left alone and they were not culled and bred carefully, then in a few generations they would go back to the very dull color of carp. And you see enormous carp. The carp are known to have lived in excess of 200 years. There was one carp that had been passed down from family member to family member and from family to family, and they knew it was old. When it died, I did not know this before studying about carp, but the scales on a fish have indications sort of like the rings of a tree, and you can determine the age of the fish from that. And there was one fish who's, I keep forgetting its name, I need to look that up again, that was very famous. When he died, they examined him, and he was 227 years old. So they can live a long time. And one of the reasons they live a long time is carp is the worst food fish ever. If you've ever tried to eat a carp, I'm sorry. We have carp, I'm from Tennessee, and we have carp in the lakes where we live. And they used to joke about the only way to cook a carp was you after you catch it, you slather it with mud and you nail it to a pine board and you bake the board in a 500-degree oven for 12 hours. You take it out, you take the carp off the board, throw away the carp, and eat the board. That's the only way to eat carp because they're a bony fish. They don't taste very good, and that's why you get these enormous carp that nobody thinks about catching them because they're terrible to eat. So the carp that we know today, these brocaded carp, nishiki koi, were only invented in the early 1800s. They were only created in the early 1800s. But prior to that, the Song Dynasty in China, back around 1000 AD, they had developed goldfish. And goldfish can grow quite large even, and so they developed goldfish from Prussian carp. And they can be, they were used for decorative purposes and in gardens and things as well. A common fingerling of a carp can cost just $10. If you get an adult specimen that's nice, it can be $300. If you buy a classic, beautiful carp, a prize koi, it can be $20,000. So the Japanese are very serious about their koi. And by the way, if you're in China or Korea and you see these fish, they're not called koi. Koi is a Japanese word. They simply refer to them as carp. Now, in terms of aesthetic principles, this beautiful garden, one of the principles that is often used in gardens, and some of the guides have referred to it as we've gone along, you'll notice there's a mountain in the background. That mountain is not part of the garden, but they use what's called borrowed scenery, and that is the gardener will always consider what's behind as well, and will incorporate that into the visual impact. So the borrowing of scenery to incorporate views outside the parameters of the garden are part of what they do. They also will focus on miniaturization, rocks that represent mountains, ponds, or seas, the use of perspective. They will use, for instance, pine trees, and in order to give a sense of greater distance, that the garden is larger than it appears, they will take a similar tree, use a larger version close to a viewing point, and then a smaller version of the same tree further away. And this difference in size makes it look like the perspective, you're looking much further away than that, and they're very intentional about that sort of thing. They do a lot with concealment. The different kinds of gardens, a Zen garden, which is usually a dry garden, is intended to be viewed from the outside all at once. Now, it's possible that you can walk around. One of the most famous gardens in the world is in Kyoto, and it's one of the 24 places that National Geographic says you must see before you die. It's a Zen garden, and it has 15 stones in the gravel. Now, you don't ever go to a Zen garden and decide you're going to walk out there and see what the stones look like from the other side. Okay, you don't go into a Zen garden, But that rayon, is particular garden, you cannot see all 15 stones at once. You can never see more than 14 of them. And according to Zen philosophy, you have to achieve enlightenment before you can see 15 of them at one time. But you can walk around, there's an L shape around it, and you can see different views from the outside. So Zen gardens are to be seen from outside. I'll talk about Chinese gardens in a minute. Chinese gardens are intended to be seen from the buildings that are on the property. But the most common version of Japanese gardens are sort of promenade gardens, which means you're intended to walk through them. And they use concealment, they use plants so that at various turns that you make, and as you walk through it, you will get different views in different places. So the idea of concealment, not showing you everything at one time, is another principle that they use. They also will focus on asymmetry. You'll notice the different shapes, the river splits, there are different size and shaped bushes, different size and shaped rocks. There's never a formal kind of balance the way we think of it. Say, okay, you got a rock here, so you need a rock over there. No, that's not the Japanese way. That's not the approach to gardens. They will never line things up like that. Things are either placed random to one another or they're at diagonals, contrasting angles, so that it never appears as though this stuff was placed there, but rather that it just occurred to be there. And as I said before, the Japanese gardens, the creating of a Japanese garden is considered as much of an art as any of the other arts, painting, calligraphy, block printing, any of that. Truly, there are masters and there are gardens that are hundreds and hundreds of years old that they know exactly who designed it, because that has come down to us the same way we know who painted a painting hundreds and hundreds of years ago, if it's a real masterwork. This is the Yuan Gardens in Shanghai. It's actually in downtown Shanghai. It's hard to believe that, seeing the garden, but I want to talk a little bit about the differences between Chinese gardens, which were original. Chinese gardens came over to Japan, and then how they differ from Japanese gardens. The Yuan Garden is a good example. It's entirely walled in. A lot of Zen gardens, I mean, if it's a private garden, it'll be walled in, but a lot of the public gardens are not walled in the same way. They'll have multiple entrances. Chinese gardens are walled in. They will have either one or two water-featured ponds, sometimes connected by a canal, an assortment of various halls and pavilions. One of the major differences, two major differences between Chinese and Japanese gardens. Chinese gardens, much more of a focus on the buildings. The buildings will be central, they will be ornate. You'll notice that in this Yuan Garden, you can see the roof line. It's quite spectacular. So the buildings are much the focus in Chinese. In Japanese gardens, the buildings are much simpler. They tend to be smaller, like tea houses or smaller dwellings, and they're out away from the center of the garden. They are not supposed to be the focus, whereas they are in the Chinese garden. The buildings are an important part of what you see. Chinese gardens also will put the building either next to or over the water, as you can see here. Now, how many of you all went to the Golden Pavilion? Right? The Golden Pavilion is actually a Chinese style garden. It follows more Chinese aesthetic than it does Japanese. In fact, they say the bottom floor, which was the Golden Pavilion, is much more Japanese. The second and third floor, I mean, it's plated with gold. You don't get much more ornate than that. And it sits right on the edge of the water. Those are not typically Japanese style, and so they intentionally designed that according to more Chinese style. The Chinese gardens are intended to be viewed from the buildings. As you can tell from here, it's over the water, and the idea is that from inside the building, through the windows, or on the various patios or decks that they have, that's where the best views are. In a Japanese garden, it's either in the Zen Garden, the dry gardens, to view them from outside, or to wander through the garden in order to experience it in Japanese gardens. So very different approach in terms of the Chinese gardens are entirely for the people who are in the buildings or at the buildings, and Japanese gardens are much more wandering around. In Chinese gardens, they have symbols of rocks and things like that, but in Chinese gardens, they will take an unusual stone or some other feature, an unusual tree, particularly stones that look like animals and things, and they will make that a highlight. I mean, they'll make it a center point, and so that you can walk around it and experience it from different angles, and they're really a focal point. Whereas in Japanese gardens, while stones are very important, they'll be much more incorporated into the overall visual impact. It's not like they're shining a spotlight on it in a Japanese garden the way they almost are in a Chinese garden. You do get marine landscapes, but the marine landscapes in a Chinese garden tend to be more formal. In a Japanese garden, they want it to look much more natural, as though it's naturally occurring. So the rocks are more worn, they imitate beaches and that sort of thing. So there are very distinct differences. And again, given when the gardens first came over, start of the 700s, it took a while for the Japanese aesthetic to really take over. And it was during the high-end period that the gardens really became a feature. I've mentioned that they don't use formal perspective, Western style formal perspective. And you know what I mean by that. You've seen, if you've ever had an art class, like a railroad track. And it's wide right here, and then you see it getting narrower in the distance until it looks like it touches. That's a formal Western approach to perspective, that you use size in that way. Well, they use size as well, but it's even more common in an Asian perspective. This is Chinese as well as Japanese, that the things closer to you will be darker and they'll be much more clearly defined, as you see here. The things that are middle ground will be less defined and not quite as dark. And so there's a foreground, then a middle ground, and then in the background you will have things that are much less distinct and much lighter. This level of definition, even more than size, is the way that perspective is represented in much of Asian art. This is exactly the technique that they will use in gardens as well. That they will have greater distinction, easier to see up front, and then further away they'll have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And sometimes the background in gardens, in Japanese gardens, will be borrowed scenery. It will be mountains or tall trees outside the parameter of the garden, and they'll take all that into account. Sometimes gardens are intended to be intellectual puzzles. You will experience something, and the challenge, particularly Zen gardens, which are meditation gardens, like, why can't I see all 15 stones at once? Well, you're supposed to consider, to think about, to meditate on, why is that the case in a Zen garden, like in Kyoto? But there is supposed to be features in a Japanese garden, and again, even especially a Zen Japanese garden, where you are supposed to be challenged with what you're perceiving and how this fits together and what effect is this having on you and why is that. So those are all parts of the gardens as well. This again is the Golden Pavilion. If you haven't been there, and I say ornate, it's got very ornate gold leaf, but then the bottom, much simpler. This is much more a Japanese style, this is more Chinese style, and it sits right on the edge of the water, which is why it is more a Chinese style in terms of the design than it is Japanese, although it's, I believe, the most visited site in Japan. As I've said before, if you have not been there, if you ever do go, you'll have a chance to see it with 30,000 of your closest friends, because it's very busy there. Some of the excellent gardens, this Ryoanji is the Zen garden that I mentioned, is one of the 24 places National Geographic says you must see before you die. And others, you've already been to Kyoto. I prepared this initially for people who had not yet been there on the last leg of the cruises. But these are examples. If you've not had a chance to go to Kyoto, Kyoto is the garden center. It was the capital. Remember, gardens originally were the pleasure gardens of the emperor and nobility. And so because Kyoto for hundreds of years was the capital, then a lot of gardens are there. There are a lot of temples there, Buddhist temples that have gardens, a lot of Shinto shrines that have gardens, and so I've had people ask me, what should I go see? I prepared this list in terms of some of the most popular places of gardens in Kyoto, but you can just walk down the street in Kyoto and stumble upon a Shinto shrine or a Buddhist temple, and there will be gardens there. Put that up. I keep promising to do it. I don't want to forget. This is the website where all of the videos that we do on this cruise will be up the last week in May, but then also all of the other cruises that we've done, all the lectures are there. Are there any questions about the Japanese gardens? If it's, don't ask me how to grow a black pine tree, because I'm not an expert on the agricultural side of it, but just the design side as I've studied. Any questions about any of that? Yeah.
So few people live in individual houses. Very few people have their own gardens these days in Japan, right?
Right.
They all live in high-rises.
Right.
So these are public. around the city?
Most of the gardens that I have pictures of here are public gardens. Now, there are older homes, like some of you went to Chiran, in the south. They are samurai houses, and each of them has a small garden. One of the things about a Japanese garden is it does not require a lot of space, because miniaturization is one of the principles. You know, you can take a relatively small space, and if you know what you're doing, or if you get someone who knows what they're doing, they can create quite an extraordinary experience by using rocks. You know, in the Chiran, for instance, you'd walk in and there was an area that might have been, 100 to 150 square feet. They would have 12-foot high stones, pointed stones that represented the mountains or the skies in one corner, and then water features, and down from that. It didn't take much room at all. And again, if you don't have room for water features, you can use stone to represent that, because that is part of the aesthetic.